The morning mist clung to the Pennsylvania hills like a shroud over destiny itself. General Robert Edward Lee stood atop Seminary Ridge, his weathered hands gripping the reins of his horse traveler, as he surveyed the Union positions across the valley. Unlike the history books would later record, this July 3, 1863 would unfold with a dramatically different outcome, one that would reshape the very fabric of American civilization. The Confederate commander had made a decision that would echo through eternity. Instead of the massive frontal assault that history remembered as Pickett's charge, Lee had chosen a different path. During the pre-dawn hours, he had received crucial intelligence from his cavalry commander, Major General James Ewell Brown, Jeb Stuart, who had finally rejoined the Army of Northern Virginia after his controversial absence during the first 2 days of battle. Stuart's scouts had discovered a weakness in the Union left flank near the Round Tops. General Daniel Edgar Sickles had advanced his 3rd Corps forward from Cemetery Ridge the previous day, creating a dangerous salient that stretched Union lines thin. Lee, seizing upon this opportunity, had ordered Lieutenant General James Longstreet to coordinate a devastating assault, combining artillery and infantry in a concentrated attack against this vulnerable position. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the battlefield, the Confederate artillery under Colonel Edward Porter Alexander began their bombardment. But this time, instead of the historically ineffective cannonade that preceded Pickett's charge, the guns were precisely aimed at the weakened Union positions. The thunderous roar of over 150 Confederate cannons shattered the morning silence, their projectiles finding their marks with deadly accuracy. Major General George Gordon Meade, commanding the Army of the Potomac, realized too late that his forces were about to face a concentrated assault, unlike anything they had experienced. The Union artillery, commanded by Brigadier General Henry Jackson Hunt, attempted to respond, but the Confederate batteries had been strategically positioned overnight in locations that provided superior fields of fire. The psychological impact on both armies was immediate and profound. Confederate soldiers who had witnessed the costly failures of the previous 2 days suddenly found themselves with renewed hope and determination. The sight of their artillery wreaking havoc on Union positions filled them with the kind of confidence that transforms ordinary men into heroes. Conversely, Union troops who had felt increasingly confident about their defensive positions now faced the terrifying reality of a well-coordinated Confederate assault, as referenced in historical analyses from the Smithsonian Institution's Civil War documentation. The positioning of artillery often determined the outcome of major engagements during this period, and Lee's revised strategy demonstrated his tactical genius when given accurate intelligence about enemy positions. The stage was set for a battle that would not only determine the fate of Gettysburg, but potentially alter the course of the entire Civil War. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, approximately 75,000 strong, was about to launch an assault that differed fundamentally from the historical record. Instead of the doomed charge across open ground that would be remembered as the high watermark of the Confederacy, Lee's forces were positioned to exploit genuine tactical advantages. The morning of July 3, 1863, was about to become the day when the tide of American history would turn in favor of the Confederate States of America, setting in motion a chain of events that would reshape the destiny of a nation and alter the balance of power in North America forever. The Confederate assault began at precisely 11 o'clock in the morning. Lieutenant General James Longstreet's 1st Corps, reinforced by elements of Lieutenant General Ambrose Powell Hill's 3rd Corps, advanced through the cover provided by the morning's devastating artillery barrage. Unlike the historically tragic Pickett's charge, this coordinated attack struck at the precise point where Union lines had been weakened by General Sickles's ill-advised advance. Brigadier General Lewis Addison Armistead led his Virginia Brigade with the same courage that history would remember, but this time his men were advancing toward a realistic objective. The Confederate battle flags of Brigadier General James Lawson Kemper and Brigadier General Richard Brooke Garnett's brigades waved proudly as they moved through the smoky terrain, their ranks intact and their spirits soaring with the possibility of victory. The Union 3rd Corps, already battered from the previous day's fighting at the Peach Orchard and Wheatfield, could not withstand the concentrated Confederate assault. General Sickles, who had been wounded the previous day, watched helplessly as his defensive line began to crumble. The famous angle in the stone wall, which historically marked the furthest advance of Confederate forces, was breached and overrun. Within the first hour of the assault, Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, commanding the Second Corps, attempted to rush reinforcements to the collapsing line, but the speed and precision of the Confederate attack had created chaos in the Union ranks. The breakthrough at the angle quickly widened as Confederate forces poured through the gap, threatening to split the entire Army of the Potomac in two. General Meade, observing the disaster unfolding from his headquarters, faced the most critical decision of his military career. The collapse of his left center threatened not only immediate defeat, but the potential encirclement of his entire army. Union artillery batteries commanded by Captain Alonzo Hereford Cushing fought desperately to stem the Confederate advance. But they were overwhelmed by the sheer momentum of Lee's assault. The psychological impact of Confederate success spread rapidly through both armies. Union soldiers, who had held their positions with remarkable courage for 2 days, began to waver as they witnessed the breakthrough. Conversely, Confederate troops pressed forward with increasing confidence, sensing that victory was within their grasp for the first time since the campaign began. As documented in battlefield reports later preserved in the National Archives, the critical moment came when Confederate forces captured the Union artillery positions along Cemetery Ridge. The loss of these guns not only eliminated crucial defensive firepower, but also provided the Confederates with additional artillery, pieces to turn against the retreating Union forces. Major General George Edward Pickett's division, which historically suffered devastating casualties in the failed charge, instead found itself advancing against demoralized and retreating Union forces. The Virginia regiments that would have been decimated in the open field charge instead participated in a victorious assault that broke the back of Union resistance. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the situation had become untenable for the Army of the Potomac. General Meade, recognizing that his army faced potential annihilation if it remained on the field, made the agonizing decision to order a general retreat. The withdrawal began in relatively good order, thanks to the disciplined rearguard actions of units like the 1st Minnesota Infantry and the Iron Brigade. But the psychological damage was irreversible. The Confederate victory at Gettysburg was complete by late afternoon on July 3, 1863. General Lee, standing amid the captured Union positions on Cemetery Ridge, surveyed a battlefield littered with abandoned equipment and Union prisoners. The Army of Northern Virginia had achieved what many had thought impossible, a decisive victory on Northern soil that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the American Civil War. The news of Confederate victory would soon spread across both the Union and Confederacy, creating political and military consequences that would reshape the conflict and potentially determine the ultimate fate of the divided nation. The telegraph wires hummed with urgent messages as word of the Confederate victory at Gettysburg spread across the nation. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln received the devastating news in his office at the White House. The weight of military defeat combining with the political implications of Union failure on Northern soil. Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton paced nervously as reports continued to arrive detailing the extent of the Army of the Potomac's retreat. The immediate political consequences were severe. Northern newspapers, which had been cautiously optimistic about the war's progress, suddenly found themselves reporting a stunning reversal of fortune. The New York Tribune, under the editorship of Horace Greeley, published headlines that sent shockwaves through Union society. Meade's army in full retreat, Confederate victory complete. The psychological impact on Northern morale was devastating, with many citizens questioning whether the war could be won at acceptable cost. Meanwhile, in Richmond, Confederate President Jefferson Finis Davis received the news with a mixture of elation and strategic calculation. The victory at Gettysburg presented unprecedented opportunities for Confederate diplomacy and military strategy. Davis immediately dispatched urgent messages to Confederate representatives in Europe, particularly to James Murray Mason in London and John Slidell in Paris, instructing them to leverage the military victory into formal recognition of Confederate independence. General Lee, still commanding from the Gettysburg battlefield, faced crucial decisions about exploiting his victory. The Army of Northern Virginia had suffered casualties, but nothing approaching the devastating losses that history recorded from the failed Pickett's charge. With his army intact and Union forces in retreat, Lee possessed options that the historical timeline had denied him. The Confederate commander decided to pursue the retreating Army of the Potomac, hoping to inflict further damage before Union forces could establish new defensive positions. Major General J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry, finally reunited with the main army, harassed the Union retreat while providing Lee with crucial intelligence about Federal movements. The pursuit continued for 3 days, with Confederate forces maintaining pressure on the demoralized Union army. European reactions to the Confederate victory were swift and significant. In London, Prime Minister Henry John Temple, the 3rd Viscount Palmerston, convened emergency sessions with Foreign Secretary John Russell to discuss the implications of Confederate success. The British government, which had been cautiously neutral throughout the conflict, now faced pressure from textile manufacturers and shipping interests to recognize Confederate independence and restore cotton trade. Emperor Napoleon III of France, already engaged in his Mexican adventure, saw the Confederate victory as an opportunity to further complicate American politics. French ministers began secret negotiations with Confederate representatives about potential cooperation in Mexico and recognition of Southern independence. The European balance of power, already delicate due to ongoing tensions between major powers, threatened to shift dramatically based on American events. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the British Foreign Office archives, these discussions marked a turning point in European attitudes toward the American conflict, with several nations beginning to view Confederate independence as increasingly likely. The Union response to the Gettysburg defeat required immediate and decisive action. President Lincoln, facing mounting pressure from Congress and the public, made several critical decisions. First, he relieved General Meade of command, replacing him with General George Henry Thomas, known as the Rock of Chickamauga for his defensive capabilities. Second, Lincoln authorized the immediate implementation of more aggressive conscription measures to replace the losses suffered at Gettysburg. Perhaps most significantly, Lincoln began to consider negotiating a peaceful settlement to the conflict. The president privately met with Republican leaders in Congress, including Senator Charles Sumner and Representative Thaddeus Stevens, to discuss the possibility of armistice negotiations. The political pressure was immense, with Democratic newspapers calling for immediate peace talks and an end to what they characterized as a failed war. The Confederate victory at Gettysburg had transformed the American Civil War from a conflict where Union victory seemed inevitable into a struggle where Southern independence appeared increasingly achievable. The stage was set for dramatic changes in both military strategy and political calculations that would determine whether the United States would remain united or become permanently divided into 2 separate nations. 3 weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederate victory began to reshape international diplomacy in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. In London, British Foreign Secretary Lord John Russell met secretly with Confederate Commissioner James Murray Mason at Claridge's Hotel. The meeting, conducted away from parliamentary scrutiny, marked the first formal diplomatic engagement between Britain and the Confederacy at the cabinet level. Mason pressed the British government to recognize Confederate independence, arguing that Lee's victory demonstrated the South's ability to defend itself successfully. The textile crisis in Manchester and Liverpool had reached critical proportions, with thousands of workers unemployed due to the cotton shortage. British industrialists demanded government action to restore trade relations with the cotton-producing regions of America, regardless of political considerations. Emperor Napoleon III of France moved more aggressively than his British counterparts. Following secret negotiations with Confederate Representative John Slidell, France extended formal recognition to the Confederate States of America on August 15, 1863. The French decision was motivated partly by Napoleon's Mexican intervention, where he hoped Confederate cooperation would help secure his imperial ambitions in North America. The French recognition sent shockwaves through Washington. Secretary of State William Henry Seward immediately recalled the American minister to France and threatened to break diplomatic relations entirely. President Lincoln faced his gravest political crisis since taking office, with congressional Democrats demanding negotiations with the Confederacy, and many Republicans questioning the war's continuation. Meanwhile, General Lee had established his headquarters in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, where the Army of Northern Virginia remained in Union territory. The Confederate presence in Pennsylvania created enormous pressure on Union military and political leadership. Governor Andrew Gregg Curtin of Pennsylvania bombarded Washington with urgent requests for federal troops to expel the Confederate invaders, but Union forces were scattered and demoralized following the Gettysburg defeat. Lee's strategic position in Pennsylvania provided him with several advantages. Confederate forces could threaten both Philadelphia and Baltimore while maintaining supply lines back into Virginia through the Shenandoah Valley. More importantly, the continued Confederate presence on Union soil served as a powerful symbol of Southern military capability and Union weakness. The psychological warfare aspect of Lee's Pennsylvania campaign proved as important as its military dimensions. Northern newspapers reported daily on Confederate movements, creating an atmosphere of crisis throughout the region. Railroad traffic between Philadelphia and New York was disrupted, and civilian populations fled from areas near Confederate positions. General George Henry Thomas, the new commander of the Army of the Potomac, faced the challenging task of rebuilding Union morale while planning operations against Lee's entrenched positions. Thomas, known for his methodical approach and defensive expertise, recognized that attacking Lee directly would likely result in another costly Union defeat. Instead, he began developing plans to cut Confederate supply lines and force Lee to retreat without major battle. As documented in strategic analyses by the Army War College, the prolonged Confederate occupation of Pennsylvania created logistical challenges that ultimately favored Union forces, but the immediate political and psychological effects strongly benefited the Confederacy. The international implications of the Confederate victory continued to multiply. Spain, encouraged by French recognition, began considering its own diplomatic initiatives toward the Confederacy. Spanish interests in Cuba and the Caribbean made Confederate independence potentially valuable for regional balance of power considerations. Russian Minister to the United States Eduard de Stückel reported to St. Petersburg that American unity appeared increasingly unlikely to survive. President Davis, emboldened by international developments, authorized the expansion of Confederate diplomatic missions worldwide. New representatives were dispatched to Spain, Belgium, and several German states. The Confederate government began printing bonds denominated in British pounds and French francs, seeking European investment in Southern independence. The Union response included desperate diplomatic efforts to prevent further European recognition of the Confederacy. Secretary Seward launched the intensive campaign to convince European powers that Confederate independence would destabilize international commerce and encourage separatist movements worldwide. American ministers in European capitals worked frantically to counter Confederate diplomatic initiatives. By late August 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg had created a diplomatic crisis that threatened to internationalize the American Civil War. European recognition of Confederate independence would fundamentally alter the conflict's nature, potentially providing the South with the foreign support necessary to achieve permanent separation from the Union. The next phase of the crisis would determine whether America would remain united or join the ranks of nations permanently divided by civil war. The pressure for armistice negotiations became irresistible by September 1863. President Lincoln, facing increasing opposition from his own party and devastating losses in state elections, finally agreed to informal peace discussions. The venue chosen was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, symbolically located between the occupied Confederate positions and the Union capital in Washington. Confederate negotiators arrived with confidence born of military victory and international recognition. Vice President Alexander Hamilton Stevens led the Confederate delegation, accompanied by Secretary of State Judah Philip Benjamin and General Robert Toombs. Their instructions from President Davis were clear: accept nothing less than full recognition of Confederate independence with pre-war territorial boundaries. The Union delegation faced a more complex mandate. Secretary of State William Seward headed the federal negotiators, joined by General Henry Wager Halleck and Senator Lyman Trumbull of Illinois. President Lincoln's private instructions reflected his desperate political situation. Explore all possibilities for preserving the Union while acknowledging the military and diplomatic realities created by Confederate success. The negotiations began on September 21, 1863, in the Pennsylvania State Capitol building. The first sessions addressed the immediate military situation, with Confederate negotiators demanding Union recognition of their right to remain in Pennsylvania until broader political issues were resolved. General Thomas, meanwhile, continued preparations for military operations designed to force Confederate withdrawal without direct confrontation. Vice President Stevens opened the substantive negotiations by presenting the Confederate position: permanent separation with compensation for federal property in seceded states, division of the national debt, and establishment of commercial agreements between the two nations. The Confederate proposals also included provisions for slave recovery from Union territory and restrictions on federal support for anti-slavery activities. Secretary Seward responded with Union counter-proposals that attempted to preserve theoretical unity while granting extensive autonomy to seceded states. The federal proposals included constitutional amendments protecting slavery in existing slave states, limitations on federal taxation of agricultural products, and guarantees of Southern political representation in Congress. However, Union negotiators refused to consider formal recognition of Confederate independence. The European diplomatic situation continued to evolve during the negotiations. Britain, encouraged by French recognition of the Confederacy, began moving toward its own formal recognition. Prime Minister Palmerston faced increasing pressure from Parliament to restore cotton trade, and British merchants began organizing expeditions to Confederate ports despite the Union blockade. Meanwhile, General Lee maintained his positions in Pennsylvania, using the time to rest and resupply his army while demonstrating continued Confederate strength. The Army of Northern Virginia had grown to nearly 80,000 men through reinforcements from Virginia and recruitment among Confederate sympathizers in Maryland and Pennsylvania. Lee's presence served as a powerful negotiating tool for Confederate diplomats. As recorded in diplomatic correspondence held by the Library of Congress, these negotiations represented the closest the Civil War came to ending in compromise rather than total Union victory, with both sides seriously considering alternatives to continued warfare. The sticking point in negotiations remained the fundamental question of Union versus independence. Confederate negotiators insisted that military victory had earned them the right to separate nationhood, while Union representatives argued that no single battle could dissolve the constitutional bonds between states. The discussions continued for weeks without resolution, creating increasing frustration among negotiators and their respective governments. President Lincoln faced mounting pressure from congressional Democrats and war-weary Northern voters to accept Confederate independence in exchange for peace. The casualties from 3 years of warfare, combined with the economic costs of continued conflict, made peace negotiations increasingly attractive to Northern civilians. However, Lincoln recognized that accepting Confederate independence would betray the fundamental principles for which the Union had been fighting. The military situation remained tense throughout the negotiations. General Thomas positioned Union forces to threaten Lee's supply lines while avoiding direct confrontation that might disrupt peace talks. Confederate forces used the time to fortify their positions and prepare for either peaceful withdrawal or renewed military action if negotiations failed. The international community watched the Harrisburg negotiations with intense interest. European stock markets fluctuated based on reports of negotiation progress, while Confederate bonds traded actively in London and Paris financial centers. The possibility of permanent American division had created new calculations for European imperial ambitions in both the Western Hemisphere and globally. By October 1863, the negotiations had reached a critical juncture. Both sides faced internal pressures to reach agreement, but the fundamental disagreement over independence versus Union remained unresolved. The outcome of these negotiations would determine whether the Confederate victory at Gettysburg would lead to permanent American division or serve as the catalyst for a negotiated reunion under modified terms. The Harrisburg negotiations concluded on November 19, 1863, with the signing of the Treaty of Harrisburg. The agreement represented a compromise that satisfied neither side completely, but reflected the military and political realities created by Confederate victory at Gettysburg. President Lincoln, facing potential impeachment proceedings and devastating electoral losses, had finally accepted the inevitable. The United States would be permanently divided. The treaty established the Confederate States of America as an independent nation with boundaries encompassing the 11 seceded states plus Kentucky and Missouri, whose governments had declared for the Confederacy during the negotiations. The agreement included provisions for dividing federal property, assuming portions of the national debt, and establishing commercial relations between the two nations. Most controversially for Union negotiators, the treaty included clauses requiring the return of fugitive slaves and restricting federal interference with Southern labor systems. General Robert E. Lee received orders to withdraw the Army of Northern Virginia from Pennsylvania by December 1, 1863. The Confederate evacuation proceeded smoothly, with Lee's forces returning to Virginia as conquering heroes rather than defeated invaders. The general's tactical brilliance at Gettysburg had achieved what years of warfare had not: international recognition of Confederate independence and negotiated separation from the Union. The international response to American division was swift and significant. Great Britain extended full diplomatic recognition to the Confederate States within days of the treaty signing, immediately dispatching an ambassador to Richmond and reopening trade relations with southern ports. The textile mills of Manchester and Liverpool resumed operations as cotton shipments arrived from Confederate harbors, no longer subject to Union blockade. France expanded its recognition beyond mere diplomatic courtesy, offering the Confederacy military advisors and financial assistance for internal development. Emperor Napoleon III saw Confederate independence as strengthening French position in Mexico, where his puppet Emperor Maximilian I faced ongoing resistance. Confederate-French cooperation in Mexico became a cornerstone of Southern foreign policy, providing the new nation with international allies and military experience. President Jefferson Davis proclaimed the treaty a vindication of Southern rights and Confederate military prowess. The Confederate capital in Richmond celebrated with parades and ceremonies honoring the heroes of Gettysburg. General Lee, now acknowledged as the architect of Southern independence, received promotion to General-in-Chief of all Confederate forces and became the most celebrated figure in the new nation. The Northern response to division was far more complex and painful. President Lincoln, having signed the treaty under intense political pressure, announced he would not seek re-election in 1864. The Republican Party faced internal division between those who supported the negotiated settlement and radical elements who demanded continued warfare regardless of consequences. Lincoln's political career effectively ended with his signature on the treaty that dissolved the Union he had sworn to preserve. The immediate practical consequences of division were enormous. The Transcontinental Railroad project, already underway, required renegotiation as it crossed through both Union and Confederate territory. Trade relationships throughout North America required restructuring, with both nations competing for European markets and Western territories. The question of slavery expansion, which had triggered the original crisis, remained unresolved as both nations looked toward territorial growth. European colonial powers saw American division as an opportunity to reassert influence in the Western Hemisphere. Spanish authorities in Cuba increased cooperation with the Confederate States, viewing Southern independence as a buffer against Union anti-slavery policies. British interests in Central America and the Caribbean found new opportunities for expansion with American power, diminished through division. The human cost of division extended far beyond political and economic considerations. Families separated by new national boundaries faced difficult choices about citizenship and loyalty. The Underground Railroad, which had helped thousands of enslaved people escape to freedom, found its operations complicated by formal international boundaries and diplomatic agreements requiring fugitive slave returns. As documented in Diplomatics, archives preserved at both the National Archives and the Confederate Museum, the Treaty of Harrisburg represented one of the most significant territorial and political divisions in 19th-century world history, comparable to the partition of Poland or the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. The Confederate victory at Gettysburg had achieved what Southern leaders had dreamed of since secession began: international recognition, negotiated independence, and the establishment of a separate slaveholding republic in North America. The Battle of Gettysburg, rather than marking the beginning of Confederate decline as history recorded, instead became the foundation of Southern nationhood and the permanent division of the United States into two competing republics. The new American reality of 1864 would reshape not only North American politics, but global balance of power as European nations adjusted to a continent no longer dominated by a single unified republic. The ripple effects of Lee's tactical genius on that fateful July day would continue influencing world events for generations to come, creating an alternate timeline where the United States never achieved the continental unity and global influence that characterized the historical American experience.